We can never coexist in this base together, so you have to leave for me." Those were the words my SEAL Admiral whispered in my ear, not in private, but during our base's passing out parade, beneath a burning sky, in front of every soldier who once saluted me. I stood there, silent, humiliated, medals glinting on my chest, while the man who trained me tried to erase me from the very ground I fought to stand on. 30 minutes later, his phone beeped. The message read, "Report to Commander Eva immediately." He didn't know. I was Commander Eva. Before I tell you what happened next, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Because this story isn't about revenge, it's about what happens when pride meets power in the same uniform. You want to know how a decorated officer, someone who climbed from mechanic to command through discipline, not privilege, ends up standing in the shadow of her former mentor's betrayal? You want to understand the rage that burns when the man who taught you honor becomes the one who strips it away? Let me paint you the picture of who I was before that parade, before that whisper, before everything changed. My name is Commander Eva Martinez, and I earned every stripe on this uniform through blood, sweat, and midnight oil. I wasn't born into military royalty. I wasn't handed a commission because my daddy knew a general. I started as a mechanic. Grease under my fingernails, engine parts scattered around my boots, working 18-hour shifts because that's what it took to prove I belonged. Admiral Richard Cole found me there, in that motor pool, fixing a transmission that 3 other mechanics had given up on. He watched me work for an hour before he spoke. "Soldier," he said, "you've got the kind of precision this Navy needs in command." Those words changed my life. They also, eventually, destroyed it. He became my mentor. More than that, he became the father figure I'd lost when my real father died serving under his command in the Persian Gulf. Dad never made it home from that deployment. Cole did. And for years, I thought that meant something. I thought it meant he cared about the legacy my father left behind. I thought it meant he wanted to honor that sacrifice by lifting up his daughter. God, was I naive. Cole guided me through officer training. He recommended me for advanced tactical courses. He wrote glowing performance reviews that opened doors I never thought I'd walk through. For 15 years, I believed he was investing in my potential. What I didn't understand was that he was building something he thought he could control. He wasn't mentoring a future leader, he was creating a perfect subordinate. The first crack in our relationship came during Operation Desert Shield. We were coordinating a joint rescue mission, 3 hostages held in a compound outside Fallujah. Intelligence was thin, but Cole wanted to move fast. Too fast. I reviewed the mission parameters and saw the gaps. The insertion route was compromised. The extraction timeline was unrealistic. The backup support was inadequate. I brought my concerns to him privately. "Admiral, sir, I think we need to reassess the approach vector. The satellite imagery shows increased patrol activity along our primary route." His response was immediate and cutting. "Commander, you're here to execute orders, not second-guess strategy. We move at 0400 as planned." But I couldn't let it go. The lives of those hostages and our team hung in the balance. So I did something that would haunt our relationship forever. I went over his head. I filed a formal assessment with Central Command, outlining my tactical concerns and requesting a mission review. Central Command agreed with my assessment. The mission was postponed for 48 hours while they developed new insertion protocols. Those 2 days saved lives. The original route was hit by an IED that would have killed half our team. The new approach succeeded flawlessly. 3 hostages came home. 0 casualties. Cole never forgave me for being right. From that moment, everything changed. The mentorship stopped. The recommendations dried up. My promotion to full commander, which should have been automatic based on my service record, got buried in bureaucratic red tape. Cole made sure of that. But what he didn't count on was my persistence. What he didn't understand was that the same qualities that made me question his judgment, attention to detail, refusal to accept good enough, commitment to doing what's right over what's easy. Those qualities also made me fight for my career with everything I had. I spent 2 years navigating the Pentagon's labyrinthine promotion process. I documented every qualification, every achievement, every commendation. I built an airtight case for my advancement. And when the Defense Personnel Board finally reviewed my file, the complete file, not the sanitized version Cole had been circulating, they didn't just approve my promotion. They gave me his base. Now, let me take you back to that parade ground, where the desert sun beat down like a hammer and the assembled troops stood in perfect formation, not knowing they were about to witness the changing of the guard. The base's passing out parade happens every 6 months. It's ceremony, tradition, and theater all rolled into one. New graduates receive their assignments. Decorated officers get recognized. The chain of command flexes its muscles in front of hundreds of witnesses. I knew what was coming. The orders had been delivered to my quarters at dawn, sealed, classified, bearing the signatures of officials whose names make generals salute. But Cole didn't know. As far as he was concerned, this was just another parade where he'd play the starring role. He strutted across that parade ground like he owned every grain of sand. Chest puffed out, decorations catching the light, voice booming commands that echoed off the barracks walls. The officers saluted him with crisp precision. The enlisted personnel stood at perfect attention. Everything was exactly as it should be in Admiral Richard Cole's perfectly ordered world. But I watched the subtle changes. The way certain officers' eyes tracked to me instead of him. The slight delay in some salutes. The whispered conversations that stopped when he approached. The base grapevine is faster than any communication system the military has ever developed, and word was already spreading. Cole, however, remained oblivious. He was too busy basking in what he thought was his moment of triumph. He'd orchestrated this parade partly as a farewell gesture, his way of demonstrating his power one last time before shipping me off to some forgotten outpost where my attitude problem could be safely contained. He'd made that plan clear during our last official meeting. Commander Martinez, he'd said, leaning back in his chair with that smug smile I'd learned to hate, your transfer orders are being processed. There's a logistics position opening up in Guam. Beautiful beaches, minimal responsibility. Perfect for someone who's hit their ceiling. I'd said nothing. Just nodded and saluted and walked out of his office, knowing that in less than 72 hours, he'd be saluting me. So there I stood on that parade ground, dress uniform immaculate, medals arranged in perfect order, watching him orchestrate what he thought was my professional funeral. The irony was exquisite. Every word he spoke, every order he gave, every moment he spent demonstrating his authority, all of it was happening under the command of the woman he was trying to destroy. The sun climbed higher. The ceremony proceeded with military precision. Awards were presented. Speeches were delivered. New officers took their oaths. And through it all, Cole's confidence grew. He was performing for the crowd, but he was also performing for me. Every gesture was designed to remind me of my place in his hierarchy. That's when he made his move. As the formal ceremony concluded and the troops began to disperse, he approached me. Not officially, there was nothing formal about what happened next. He simply walked over, positioned himself so close I could smell his aftershave, and delivered his verdict in a voice only I could hear. Commander Martinez, he said, his tone conversational, but his words like ice picks. I want you to remember this moment. Look around at this base, at these soldiers, at this command structure. Remember it well, because after today, you'll never see it again. I kept my eyes forward, my expression neutral. Military bearing is a discipline, and I'd had years to perfect it. He continued, his voice dropping to that intimate whisper that made my skin crawl. We can never coexist in this base together, so you have to leave for me. The words hit me like physical blows. Not because I believed them, I knew what was coming next, but because of their casual cruelty. This was a man who'd once promised to honor my father's memory by ensuring his daughter had every opportunity to serve with distinction. Now he was trying to end my career out of petty spite. But what made it worse was the public nature of the humiliation. He'd chosen this moment, this place, these witnesses, specifically to maximize the damage. Other officers were watching. Enlisted personnel were within earshot. He wanted everyone to see Commander Eva Martinez getting dressed down by her superior. He wanted to plant the seeds of doubt about my competence, my future, my worthiness to wear the uniform. I stood there, silent, humiliated, medals glinting on my chest, while the man who trained me tried to erase me from the very ground I fought to stand on. The rage that built inside me during those seconds was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the hot anger of combat or the sharp fury of injustice. This was something deeper, colder, more controlled. It was the rage of betrayal mixed with the pain of lost trust. It was the anger of a daughter whose surrogate father had chosen ego over honor. I wanted to turn and face him. I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of his threats and his posturing and his pathetic attempt to salvage his wounded pride. I wanted to explain that while he'd been planning my exile, I'd been accepting my promotion. I wanted to watch his face change when he realized that the woman he was trying to humiliate was already his commanding officer. But I didn't. I held my position, maintained my composure, and let him have his moment. Because I knew something he didn't. In approximately 30 minutes, his phone would beep. And everything would change. Those 30 minutes stretched like hours. The parade ground slowly emptied as units returned to their duties. Officers clustered in small groups, discussing assignments and procedures. The normal rhythm of base life resumed, but underneath it all, I could feel the tension building. Word was spreading. Not officially, that would come later, but through the informal networks that keep military bases functioning. A whispered conversation between senior NCOs. A glance exchanged between department heads. A slight change in the way certain personnel positioned themselves in relation to Cole and me. I walked through those corridors I'd known for years, past offices where I'd served as a junior officer, around corners where I'd once hurried to keep up with Cole's longer stride. But now everything felt different. The same hallways, the same doors, the same fluorescent lighting, but the entire context had shifted. Officers who passed me in the corridor offered salutes that lingered a fraction of a second longer than regulation required. Enlisted personnel stepped aside with a deference that went beyond normal courtesy. The base was adapting to a new reality, even though the official announcement hadn't been made. Cole, meanwhile, remained completely unaware. I watched him from a distance as he continued his post-parade routine, stopping by the communications center to review overnight dispatches, checking in with department heads about daily operations, playing the role of commanding officer with the confidence of someone who believes his position is unassailable. He had no idea that the authority he was exercising was no longer his to exercise. Every order he gave, every decision he made, every interaction he had with base personnel, all of it was happening under my command, whether he knew it or not. The irony was almost unbearable. Here was a man who'd spent months orchestrating my downfall, who'd used every tool at his disposal to undermine my career, who'd just publicly humiliated me in front of our colleagues, and he was doing it all while unknowingly serving under my authority. I found myself in my quarters, or what had been my quarters until that morning, when they'd officially become the temporary residence of the base's commanding officer. The promotion orders were spread across my desk, bearing seals and signatures that represented the highest levels of military authority. The language was formal, bureaucratic, final. Commander Eva Martinez is hereby appointed to the position of base commander, effective immediately, with all rights, responsibilities, and authorities therein. As I read those words for perhaps the 10th time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly. Not satisfaction. Something more complex, a mixture of vindication and sadness, of professional pride and personal loss. This should have been a moment of pure celebration. After years of fighting for recognition, after months of navigating bureaucratic obstacles, after enduring Cole's attempts at sabotage, I'd finally achieved the command I'd earned through merit and dedication. I was about to become the youngest base commander in the Navy's Pacific Fleet. It was everything I'd worked for, everything my father would have been proud of. But it was also the final destruction of a relationship that had once meant everything to me. The man who'd guided my early career, who'd helped shape me into the officer I'd become, who'd filled the role of mentor and father figure, that man was about to discover that his former protege now held his fate in her hands. There was no joy in that realization. Only a deep, aching sadness for what we'd lost and what we could never recover. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my quarters. Voices discussing logistics and scheduling. The normal business of running a military base continued, but I knew that in a few minutes, everything would change. Cole's phone would beep. He'd read a message that would turn his world upside down. And then we'd find out what kind of man he really was. 28 minutes had passed since his whispered threat on the parade ground. 28 minutes of him operating under the illusion that he still controlled my destiny. 28 minutes of me carrying the knowledge that would shatter that illusion forever. I stood up, straightened my uniform, and prepared for what was about to happen. Whatever Cole's reaction would be, anger, disbelief, humiliation, rage, I would meet it with the dignity befitting my new rank. I wouldn't gloat. I wouldn't lecture. I wouldn't take revenge. But I also wouldn't apologize for claiming the position I'd earned. The knock on my door came at exactly 30 minutes after his threat. Not Cole himself, that would come later, but a junior officer with a message. Ma'am, Admiral Cole has received notification to report to your office immediately. He appears confused about the directive. Thank you, Lieutenant. Please inform the Admiral that I'll see him in 5 minutes. 5 minutes to transform from the humiliated subordinate he dismissed on the parade ground into the commanding officer who would shape his future. 5 minutes to shift from the role of victim to the position of authority. 5 minutes to prepare for the most important conversation of both our careers. I made my way to the commander's office, my office now, and settled behind the desk that had been Cole's domain for the past 3 years. The same desk where he'd signed orders, reviewed reports, and made decisions that affected hundreds of personnel. The same desk where he'd planned my exile and orchestrated my downfall. Now it was mine. The intercom buzzed. Admiral Cole is here to see you, ma'am. Send him in. The door opened, and there he stood. Still in his dress uniform from the parade, still carrying himself with the bearing of supreme command, but with something new in his expression. Confusion. The first crack in his certainty. He'd received the message, report to Commander Eva immediately. But he hadn't yet processed what it meant. The cognitive dissonance was visible on his face, the struggle between what he thought he knew and what the evidence was telling him. Commander Martinez, he said, his voice carrying a note of irritation, I received some kind of administrative error directing me to report to you. Obviously, there's been a miscommunication in the command structure. I stood up slowly, letting the moment stretch. Let him see me behind that desk, in that position, with the authority he'd never imagined I could possess. Please have a seat, Admiral. The words hung in the air between us. A directive from a subordinate to a superior. Except we both knew, in that instant, that the hierarchy had shifted in ways he was only beginning to understand. His confusion deepened. He remained standing, his military bearing intact, but his confidence wavering. Commander, I think there's been some mistake. I don't report to Admiral Cole, I said, my voice steady and formal. Please take a seat. We have matters to discuss. Something in my tone, the authority, the certainty, the complete absence of deference, finally broke through his denial. He looked at me more carefully, taking in my position behind the commander's desk, the way I was holding myself, the subtle but unmistakable signs that everything had changed. Slowly, reluctantly, he sat down. I opened the folder on my desk and removed the documents that would explain everything. The promotion orders, the command transfer, the official correspondence from the Pentagon that had sealed his fate and elevated mine. Admiral, I said, sliding the papers across the desk, as of 0600 this morning, I have been appointed commanding officer of this base. These orders supersede all previous command arrangements and are effective immediately. He stared at the documents for a long moment before picking them up. I watched his face as he read, watched the disbelief give way to shock, the shock give way to anger, the anger give way to something that looked almost like grief. When he finally looked up, his voice was barely a whisper. How? The same way any officer receives a promotion, Admiral. Through merit, qualification, and the recommendation of superior officers who believe in their potential. The irony of those words wasn't lost on either of us. He'd spent months trying to block my advancement, but his efforts had only delayed the inevitable. My record spoke for itself. My qualifications were undeniable. And eventually, the right people had noticed. This is impossible, he said, but the fight was already going out of his voice. You can't just, who authorized this? I pointed to the signatures on the documents. Names he recognized. Authorities he couldn't question. The highest levels of military command had spoken, and their decision was final. Admiral, I said gently, you taught me something important early in my career. You said that the military doesn't advance people based on politics or favoritism or personal relationships. It advances people based on their ability to lead, to make hard decisions, and to put the mission above personal interests. His face flushed. He knew exactly what I was referring to, the principles he'd preached but failed to practice when it came to handling my career. You also taught me, I continued, that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. Every day, with every decision, with every interaction with the people under your command. The silence stretched between us. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of base operations, vehicles moving, personnel going about their duties, the steady rhythm of military life. But in this office, everything had stopped. Finally, Cole spoke. What happens now? It was the question I'd been dreading. As his new commanding officer, I had the authority to shape his future. I could reassign him to a position of minimal responsibility. I could recommend him for early retirement. I could make his remaining military service as difficult and humiliating as he'd tried to make mine. But that's not who I was. That's not the officer my father had died to protect, or the leader Cole himself had helped train, or the commander the space needed. What happens now, Admiral, is that we do our jobs. You have experience and expertise that this base needs. I have ideas and energy that could benefit our mission. We can work together professionally, despite our personal history. He stared at me for a long moment. I could see him processing this unexpected response, struggling to understand how the woman he'd tried to destroy could offer him professional dignity. You're not going to, he began, then stopped. I'm not going to what? Humiliate you the way you tried to humiliate me? Use my authority to settle personal scores? Treat you the way you treated me? I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. Admiral, you taught me about honor and integrity and putting duty above personal feelings. I learned those lessons well. Too well to abandon them now. Something shifted in his expression. The defensive anger was fading, replaced by something that might have been shame. For the first time since he'd entered my office, he looked like the mentor I'd once respected instead of the adversary he'd become. Eva, he said quietly, using my first name for the first time in years, But whatever he was about to say was interrupted by a knock on the door. The business of running a base doesn't pause for personal reckonings. Come in, I called. A senior NCO entered with a stack of reports requiring command attention. Daily briefings, personnel issues, operational updates, the routine responsibilities that define military leadership. Ma'am, these require your review and signature. The NCO's formal tone and direct approach to me, rather than Cole, made the new command structure unmistakably clear. I was no longer the subordinate officer seeking approval. I was the commander making decisions. Thank you, Sergeant. Please place them on my desk and inform the department heads that I'll be conducting my first command briefing at 1,400 hours. Yes, ma'am. As the NCO left, I turned back to Cole. He was watching this exchange with a mixture of fascination and resignation. The reality of his changed circumstances was settling in, and with it, perhaps, a new understanding of who I'd become. Admiral, I said, you're welcome to attend the briefing. Your institutional knowledge of this base and its operations would be valuable as I transition into command. It was an olive branch. An opportunity for him to maintain dignity and purpose despite the dramatic shift in our relationship. An acknowledgement that whatever had happened between us personally, his professional experience still had value. He stood up slowly, straightening his uniform with the automatic precision of decades in service. When he reached the door, he paused and turned back. Commander Martinez, he said formally, then stopped and corrected himself. Commander, ma'am, this base is in excellent hands. It wasn't quite an apology. It wasn't quite an acknowledgement of his mistakes. But it was something, a recognition of the officer I'd become and the leader he'd helped create, even if he'd later tried to destroy. After he left, I sat alone in my new office, surrounded by the symbols and responsibilities of command. The weight of what had just happened began to settle in. Not just the promotion or the vindication or the sweet justice of the moment, but the cost of it all. I'd achieved everything I'd worked for, but I'd lost something too. The relationship with Cole had been complicated, painful, ultimately destructive, but it had also been formative. He'd shaped me as an officer and as a person. His betrayal had hurt so deeply because his mentorship had meant so much. Now that relationship was over. Not just changed or damaged, but fundamentally altered beyond repair. I was his commanding officer now, and he was my subordinate. Whatever personal connection we'd once shared was buried beneath the weight of rank and authority and too many wounds that could never fully heal. But perhaps that was as it should be. Perhaps some relationships aren't meant to survive the transformations that define military careers. Perhaps the best tribute to what Cole had taught me was to become the kind of leader he'd claimed to value, one who put duty above personal feelings, mission above personal relationships, honor above revenge. The days that followed were a whirlwind of transition briefings, personnel meetings, and administrative responsibilities. Taking command of a military base isn't just about authority, it's about understanding every aspect of a complex organization and the hundreds of people who make it function. Cole, to his credit, handled the transition professionally. He attended briefings, provided insights when asked, and carried out his assignments with the competence I'd always known he possessed. We interacted formally, politely, efficiently. The personal animosity was buried beneath layers of military protocol and mutual professionalism. But I could see the cost it was taking on him. The man who'd once commanded with absolute confidence now carried himself with the careful precision of someone who knew his position was precarious. He was learning what I'd experienced for months, the stress of serving under someone who had every reason to distrust you. 3 weeks into my command, he requested a private meeting. Not through official channels, but through a simple knock on my office door after duty hours. Come in. He entered without his usual swagger, closing the door quietly behind him. Commander, I wanted to speak with you about my future assignment. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. The same chair where he'd sat during our first confrontation, but the dynamic was completely different now. This wasn't about power or dominance or settling scores. This was about two professional officers trying to find a path forward. What did you have in mind, Admiral? I think we both know this situation isn't sustainable long-term, he said carefully. My presence here undermines your authority and creates unnecessary tension among the personnel. It's not fair to you, and it's not good for the base. He was right, and we both knew it. Despite our professional interactions, the underlying tension was affecting the entire command structure. Officers were watching our every interaction, looking for signs of conflict or favoritism. Enlisted personnel were unsure how to navigate the complex dynamics between their former and current commanders. What are you suggesting? I asked. I've been in contact with Pacific Fleet Command about a training position at Coronado. It would be a lateral transfer, no reduction in rank, no negative implications for my record. Just a change of venue that would benefit everyone involved. It was a graceful exit. A way for him to maintain his dignity while removing the source of ongoing tension. A solution that served the needs of the command while preserving both our careers. Admiral, I said after a long pause, I think that sounds like an excellent opportunity. Coronado's training command has an outstanding reputation, and your experience would be valuable there. Relief flickered across his face. Not just because I was approving his transfer, but because I was treating it as a positive career move rather than an exile or punishment. There's something else, he said, his voice dropping. Something I need to say before I leave. I waited, knowing this was the conversation we'd been avoiding since that first day in my office. I was wrong, he said simply. About you, about your potential, about the way I handled your career. I let personal pride override professional judgment, and that's unforgivable in this job. The admission hung between us. Not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of the truth we'd both been living with. Admiral, I replied carefully, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them and move forward. You're more generous than I deserve, he said. Your father would be proud of the officer you've become. More proud than I have any right to be, given my role in trying to prevent it. The mention of my father hit harder than I'd expected. Cole had known him, served with him, been present when he'd made the ultimate sacrifice for his country. For years, I'd believed that connection meant something to Cole. Now I understood that it had, just not in the way I'd hoped. He would have been proud of a lot of things, I said. But mostly, I think he would have been proud that I served with honor, regardless of the circumstances. Cole nodded slowly. Eva, Commander, I know I can't undo the damage I've done to our relationship. But I want you to know that everything I taught you about leadership, about integrity, about putting the mission first, I meant every word of it. I just lost sight of those principles when it came to my own actions. Those principles are what guided my decisions about your transfer, Admiral. And they'll continue to guide everything I do in this command. He stood up, straightening his uniform one last time in my office. At the door, he paused and turned back. Permission to offer one final piece of advice, Commander? Granted. Never let anyone, including me, make you doubt that you earned this command. You didn't get here because of politics or favoritism or luck. You got here because you're exactly the kind of officer this Navy needs in leadership positions. Thank you, Admiral. That means more than you know. He saluted me then, not the perfunctory salute of military protocol, but the slow, deliberate salute of genuine respect. I returned it with equal formality, and for a moment, we were simply two officers honoring the best traditions of military service. After he left, I sat in my office thinking about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. 6 months ago, I'd been fighting for basic recognition of my qualifications. 3 months ago, I'd been fearing for my career as Cole systematically undermined my prospects. Today, I was the commanding officer of one of the Navy's most important Pacific bases, and he was preparing for a dignified transfer to a position that suited his experience and expertise. The anger that had sustained me through the worst of our conflict was gone, replaced by something more complex. Not forgiveness, exactly. Some betrayals cut too deep for that. But understanding, perhaps. Recognition that people are complicated, that mentors can fail, that even good officers can make terrible decisions when pride and fear cloud their judgment. Cole's transfer was processed within a week. I signed the orders myself, noting for the record that Admiral Richard Cole had served the space with distinction and was being reassigned to meet the Navy's training needs. No mention of conflict, no suggestion of disciplinary action, no hint of the personal drama that had defined our final months working together. His departure ceremony was small but dignified. The Corps staff assembled to wish him well, and he offered brief remarks about the privilege of serving alongside outstanding personnel. When he shook my hand at the end, he said quietly, "Take care of them, Commander. They deserve the best leadership the Navy can provide." "I intend to, Admiral." And then he was gone. The man who'd shaped the first half of my military career simply walked away, leaving me to define the second half on my own terms. The months that followed were the most challenging and rewarding of my professional life. Running a major military installation requires every skill I developed over 15 years of service: technical expertise, personnel management, strategic thinking, crisis resolution, diplomatic coordination with allied forces, budget oversight, and the countless small decisions that keep a complex organization functioning. But more than that, it required me to become the kind of leader I'd always aspired to be. Not the harsh authoritarian that some might have expected after my conflict with Cole, but the principled, fair-minded commander who put mission accomplishment and personnel welfare above personal considerations. I instituted regular town halls where enlisted personnel could raise concerns directly with command staff. I streamlined the promotion review process to ensure that merit, not politics, determined advancement opportunities. I pushed for improved family housing and recreational facilities, understanding that quality of life directly impacts operational readiness. Most importantly, I made sure that every person under my command understood that their contributions were valued, their potential was recognized, and their career development was a priority. No one would experience under my leadership what I'd endured under Cole's. No one would have their aspirations dismissed or their qualifications questioned because of personal animosity or institutional bias. The base flourished under this approach. Morale improved measurably. Retention rates increased. Operational efficiency reached new highs. 6 months into my command, Pacific Fleet Headquarters sent a team to study our procedures and potentially implement them across other installations. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of success came in the form of individual stories. The petty officer who'd been overlooked for advancement because of a minor administrative error, until my team caught the mistake and corrected it. The junior officer struggling with family pressures who found the support and resources she needed to maintain both personal stability and professional excellence. The senior NCO approaching retirement who was given the opportunity to mentor younger personnel and pass on decades of hard-earned wisdom. These were the victories that mattered. Not the public vindication of my promotion or the sweet justice of Cole's departure, but the daily work of creating an environment where good people could do their best work in service of something larger than themselves. A year after taking command, I received a letter forwarded through official channels. The return address was Coronado, and I recognized Cole's handwriting immediately. "Commander Martinez," it began formally. "I hope this letter finds you and the base thriving. I wanted you to know that the training protocols you developed for junior officer development have been adopted here at Coronado and are producing excellent results. Your innovative approach to leadership development is being studied throughout the Pacific Fleet. I also wanted you to know that I've had occasion to discuss your command with several flag officers who have visited our facility. The consensus is unanimous. You've transformed that base into a model of military excellence. Your father would indeed be proud. I hope you'll understand if I don't make this a regular correspondence. Too much history stands between us for that. But I needed you to know that your success hasn't gone unnoticed, and it hasn't been forgotten that you treated me with more dignity than I deserved during our final weeks working together. Fair winds and following seas, Admiral Richard Cole. I read the letter several times before filing it away. Not because I needed his validation, my command spoke for itself, but because it represented a kind of closure. The mentor who'd failed me had acknowledged the leader I'd become. The relationship that had ended in betrayal was being remembered for something more positive. 2 years into my command, I was approached about a promotion to flag rank Admiral. It would mean leaving the base I'd worked so hard to improve, taking on broader responsibilities across the Pacific Fleet, and entering the rarefied world of strategic command where policy decisions affect thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in resources. The promotion board interviews were extensive. They covered everything from my tactical expertise to my personnel management philosophy to my vision for the Navy's future in an increasingly complex global environment. But the questions I remember most clearly were about leadership under pressure. Commander Martinez, one admiral asked, describe a situation where you had to lead despite significant personal and professional obstacles. I thought about Cole, about the whisper on the parade ground, about the 30 minutes between humiliation and vindication. But I also thought about everything that followed, the grace under pressure, the refusal to seek revenge, the commitment to treating even adversaries with professional dignity. Sir, I replied, I learned that true leadership isn't about having authority over others. It's about having authority over yourself. The ability to make decisions based on principle rather than emotion, to treat people fairly regardless of how they've treated you, and to focus on mission accomplishment even when personal relationships make that difficult. The promotion was approved unanimously. My change of command ceremony was held on the same parade ground where Cole had whispered his threat 3 years earlier. But this time, the context was entirely different. Instead of humiliation, I was receiving the highest honors the Navy could bestow. Instead of exile, I was advancing to broader responsibilities and greater challenges. The flag officers who attended the ceremony spoke of transformation and innovation and leadership excellence. They cited statistics about improved morale and operational efficiency. They praised the programs I'd implemented and the culture I'd created. But as I stood at that podium, looking out at the hundreds of personnel who'd served under my command, I thought about something simpler. I thought about the promise I'd made to myself on that day when Cole tried to end my career, that I would become the kind of leader who lifted others up rather than tearing them down. Standing there in my dress whites, with Admiral stars freshly pinned to my collar, I knew I'd kept that promise. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but with integrity and commitment and an understanding that leadership is ultimately about service, service to mission, service to personnel, service to ideals larger than personal ambition. In my final remarks as base commander, I talked about the privilege of serving alongside outstanding men and women who chose duty over comfort, sacrifice over safety, service over self-interest. I talked about the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of rank or background or personal history. And I talked about my father, whose sacrifice had inspired my career and whose memory had sustained me through the darkest moments of professional doubt. He taught me, I said, that wearing this uniform isn't about authority or privilege or recognition. It's about responsibility to each other, to our country, and to the principles that make military service a calling rather than just a job. As the ceremony concluded and I prepared to leave for my new assignment, a young lieutenant approached me. She was one of the junior officers who joined the base early in my command, someone I'd watched develop from uncertain newcomer to confident leader. Admiral, she said, I wanted to thank you for something you probably don't even remember. 2 years ago, when I was struggling with my first major assignment, you took time to meet with me personally. You helped me understand that making mistakes isn't failure, it's learning. That advice changed everything for me. Stories like that were the real measure of success. Not the promotion or the accolades or the vindication of having outlasted Cole's attempts at sabotage, but the knowledge that I'd made a positive difference in the lives and careers of the people who'd served under my command. As I walked away from that base for the last time, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The mechanic who'd caught an admiral's attention. The student who'd absorbed everything her mentor could teach. The officer who'd stood up for principle even when it threatened her career. The victim of betrayal who'd chosen grace over revenge. The commander who'd built something lasting and positive from the wreckage of a failed relationship. Cole had been right about one thing: we couldn't coexist in the same command. But he'd been wrong about who would have to leave. He'd been wrong about my potential, my qualifications, my worthiness to lead. Most importantly, he'd been wrong about what kind of leader I would become. I didn't lead through fear or intimidation or the casual cruelty he'd shown me. I led through competence and fairness and an unwavering commitment to bringing out the best in everyone under my command. I proved that strength doesn't require breaking others down, that authority doesn't depend on making others feel small, that true leadership is measured not by the power you wield, but by the people you develop. Looking back now, from the perspective of flag rank and broader responsibilities, I can see that my conflict with Cole was ultimately about more than personal animosity or professional jealousy. It was about competing visions of what military leadership should be. His vision was hierarchical, authoritarian, based on the belief that respect must be demanded and dissent must be crushed. Mine was collaborative, principled, founded on the understanding that the best commanders earn loyalty through competence and integrity rather than demanding it through rank and intimidation. The Navy chose my vision. Not just by promoting me, but by adopting the leadership philosophies and organizational innovations I'd developed during my command. The programs I'd created were being implemented across the fleet. The approach I'd taken to personnel development was being studied at the War College. The culture I'd built was being replicated at installations around the world. That was Cole's real legacy, not the attempts at sabotage or the moments of petty cruelty, but the fact that his failures had forced me to become a better leader than I might have been otherwise. His betrayal had taught me the importance of treating people with dignity. His attempts to end my career had shown me the value of perseverance and principle. His whispered threat on that parade ground had motivated me to prove that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. I never saw Cole again after his transfer to Coronado. I heard through military circles that he'd retired honorably after completing his training assignment, that he'd moved to a quiet coastal town somewhere in California, that he'd written a book about naval tactics that received positive reviews in professional journals. I hoped he'd found peace. Despite everything that had happened between us, I hoped he'd learned something from our conflict, just as I had. I hoped he'd come to understand that the principles he'd taught me about honor and integrity weren't just abstract concepts to be preached, but daily practices that define who we are as leaders and as human beings. The military is a small world, and occasionally I encountered officers who'd served under Cole either before or after our time together. Their opinions of him were mixed. Some remembered him as a demanding but effective commander. Others spoke of his technical expertise and tactical knowledge. But none of them mentioned the personal vindictiveness that had defined his treatment of me. Perhaps that was his private struggle, the demons he wrestled with behind closed doors. Perhaps the man who'd whispered threats on a parade ground was different from the man who'd mentored dozens of other officers with patience and skill. People are complicated, and even good leaders can make terrible choices when fear and pride override judgment. What mattered was what I'd learned from the experience and how it had shaped my approach to command. Every decision I made, every interaction I had with subordinates, every moment when personal feelings threatened to override professional judgment, all of it was informed by the memory of standing humiliated on that parade ground and choosing to respond with grace rather than revenge. That choice had defined my career more than any promotion or award or recognition. It had taught me that leadership isn't about having power over others, but about having power over yourself. The ability to do the right thing even when you have every justification to do the wrong thing. The strength to build up rather than tear down, even when you've been torn down yourself. Standing here now, with Admiral stars on my collar and the responsibility for thousands of personnel across the Pacific Fleet, I can say with certainty that I'm grateful for every moment of that painful experience. Not because I enjoyed the humiliation or the betrayal or the months of professional uncertainty, but because it forced me to become the kind of leader I'd always aspired to be. The kind of leader who listens more than speaks, who develops more than demands, who treats every person under their command as worthy of dignity and respect regardless of rank or background or personal history. The kind of leader my father would have been proud of. The kind of leader the Navy needs. The kind of leader who understands that true power isn't about the authority to destroy others, but about the wisdom to build them up. And, perhaps most importantly, the kind of leader who knows that sometimes the greatest victory isn't crushing your enemies, but proving them wrong through the simple act of being better than they believed you could be. He tried to fire me, but he never understood. True power isn't given, it's earned. And sometimes, the same voice that tried to silence you ends up saluting you. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment your city or country below. Because respect isn't rank, it's legacy.